All right, I wanted to do a little introductory explanation of my own spiritual beliefs and practices because a number of people have asked, and not everyone's willing to read a whole book on the matter, uh, understandably. So I figured I'd make a short little video, and I expect this will be 10-15 minutes long, so we'll see how we do with that. The important question is, of course, to begin with, why is it important to be spiritual in the first place? Why is that something that's desirable? There's a trend of people who say that they are spiritual but not religious. And it's such a dumb phrase because what it comes down to is I want to be interesting, but I have no self-discipline. Spirituality is connection with a spirit or spirits, right? With personalities that are not physical in nature. They could be dead people, they could be gods, they could be demons, they could be whatever, superhuman forces, daemoni. Um, but if you don't have some kind of connection, then spirituality doesn't mean anything. As I heard one Christian pastor say on the radio, you are spiritually dead if you are not in communication with spirits, which is true. But perhaps that's desirable, right? Doesn't that just mean you're not hallucinating? Well, perhaps, but it also means you could go any which way. You have no character. The Greek word for character meant to be stamped, to be marked in a certain way. And what's interesting is that in modern marketing circles, the concept of the brand has acquired a very similar connotation and even meaning to the old concept of character. Indeed, it even originates from the same kind of visual, branding is a mark that you make in order to establish property, to establish ownership. To whose herd do you belong? And character meant much the same thing back in the day. And it's cool to see the word brand beginning to acquire the connotations that character once had. I believe, in fact, these two terms might be merging. What does that have to do with spirituality? Well, if you have character, if you are on brand, it means there are some things you won't do, and some things you're expected to do, more likely to do. You know, um, an honest person doesn't lie. That's in their character, right? And if you, this is not to say that unspiritual people have no character, but spirituality, connection with a spirit, and you can anthropomorphize this as much as you like, but if it's not anthropomorphic enough and it's purely abstract, your ideas of morality and so forth, um, then it becomes less emotionally potent, becomes less influential on your thinking and on your behavior. Because humans by nature uh, have an easier time visualizing and interacting with people and not abstract ideas. They're less real at an emotional level. And so then the question becomes, well, then, if that is true in terms of human behavior, then perhaps it's actually true that these abstract ideals actually are personalities. You can reason it backwards from the effect to the cause instead of the other way around. The reality is we don't know which is true, but we can look at what sorts of lives are functional and what sorts of outcomes correspond with particular ways of living and particular values. And, spirituality works. You know who you are, and there's a kind of sanity that comes with that stability. and a reliability and trust. And those may all sound like peripheral or secular explanations for the value of spirituality. And of course, I'm sure there'll be plenty of Christians who are being like, oh, you're just taking a utilitarian approach. But Christianity can be a utilitarian in its own way as well. And I would reject the charge, but that's for another day. This is really just an introduction to the concept of the Anwei, and we're already 5 minutes in. So there are problems with pagan reconstructionism, in the sense that these are traditions. They were living traditions, like building a Stradivarius violin. That was a living tradition that was passed on, the precise techniques and everything, from generation to generation for generations, for decades, until it didn't. Now, people can still make great violins, but the tradition of Stradivarius violins is dead. You can try to reconstruct how they might have made a Stradivarius, but your process is going to be different. And the results are probably going to be different as well. You can call them great violins, but you would be factually incorrect to call them Stradivarius violins, because they were not made in the Stradivarius tradition, no matter how hard you attempt to reconstruct that living tradition. And the old religions, Asatru, for example, that were trying to revive the dead gods. The gods they worshipped aren't dead, but the knowledge of them and the connection with them under the names they had was maintained in a living tradition that was lost. And so if some modern reconstructionists were to discover those gods again, they would be by a different name and in a different guise and with different rituals. That would be the authentic rediscovery of those same gods, assuming they can be rediscovered and aren't in fact dead. And the attempted necromancy of reconstructionist, traditionalist religions is, I don't think so much evil as just kind of sad. Like, it's just not going to happen, man. You can't revive a dead tradition. And of course, there's the problem with Christianity, however, is that it detaches itself from real world outcomes so absolutely that it renders itself completely unfalsifiable. To die a martyr is just as good of an outcome to the Christian as to become a successful and happy and fulfilled family man with a great career and all the rest of it. There is no, because real world outcomes are completely divorced from the desired spirituality, the desired connection with God. So what would be most desirable is a religion that is new, that is not some decaying and rotting corpse, but one that is alive in the living world, and that hasn't made itself immortal by removing itself from the domain of life. Staying in the bios world rather than the Zoe world for you Christians out there. And so that was where I was beginning to pursue. So where does that leave me with spiritual? I want to have a connection that will give me some direction. What ideal matches this balance between something that is alive but thriving in the present, but is not, taking refuge in the Platonic world of ideas such that it can never die because it never lived truly in the first place. And the answer came to me out of a strange question about suicide. Now, if you believe in evolution, which I trust that most of anyone who watching this video would, there is a strange conundrum around the question of suicide. How is that possible? Friedrich Nietzsche or not opens, but discusses in, I believe it's the Genealogy of Morals, but one of his other books, that the bad English idea that morality is that which benefits the survival of the species. He's like, that which harmed the survival of the species probably died out ages ago. And much that is considered immoral by modern standards can often do quite good things for the survival of the species. You know, your schizophrenic shamans can have a gift of foresight and anticipating problems that perhaps other people might not. Your sociopaths, who are in many ways antisocial, can form an extremely valuable role as leaders and as warriors for your society. And in modern society, neurosurgeons, for some reason, tend to favor sociopathy as well. There are all sorts of things that we consider, and personalities that we consider to be immoral, that can actually benefit the species quite tremendously if you look at things objectively. So suicide doesn't seem like that, though, right? How can you advance your own personal self-interest, from an individualist lens, by killing yourself? It's antithetical. So if evolution favors the survival of the fittest, and suicide is possible, then the survival of the fittest must not be referring to the survival of the individual as an individual. So, what then is it favoring? What then is it benefiting? Enter the Anwei, the spirit of us, the spirit of the lineage, of which you are an avatar and a caretaker and a vessel. You are not the thing itself. You are one temporary expression of this greater living entity that is you, but is so much more than you. And that Anwei, that spirit of the line, is maybe not the greatest God, certainly not the only God, but at a very base level, at least one God that is worth worshiping and connecting with. Now, bear in mind, this is not self-worship. This is much more closely related to, it's only self-worship in the way that a Christian might consider worshiping God to be self-worship. Because they were created in the image of God, does that make it self-worship? I don't think so. Same principle applies here. You are actually getting outside of yourself in order to connect with not just your origins in the past, but also your destiny in the future. And here I don't mean destiny as in what will happen, but your destiny as in what is intended to happen. A caterpillar is destined to become a butterfly. If it gets eaten as a caterpillar, its destiny didn't change, even though its fate changed. So what is your destiny as an individual and as an expression of this lineage spirit? And we can see the real world consequences of trying to grasp at and connect with this spirit when we look at blue zones. Now, blue zones are areas in the world where people live seemingly inexplicably to extraordinarily long ages. And the three regions I spent a little bit of time studying were Okinawa, Japan, south of Japan technically, Sardinia in Italy, and Loma Linda, California. population of Seventh-day Adventists down there. And in all three of these places, of different religious traditions, with different diet that didn't vary that much from the places nearby, with genetics that were fairly similar to, again, to the regions nearby. So diet did help, and genetics did help, but they didn't explain it all the way. And the thing that had the most explanatory value for why these people lived not just longer lives, but also happier lives, which is connected, was the intergenerational connection. You had kids living with parents, living with grandparents, living with great-grandparents, who had themselves, when they were younger, lived with their parents and grandparents and great-parents. And so you have this living tradition that you were connected to. And what that living tradition is less important than having that living tradition. And so the spirit, the critical spirit, is not necessarily the particular gods and deities and superhuman forces and wood spirits and what have you that your family surrounds itself with. Though that is what you would do if you are connected to your ancestors and to your descendants in that intergenerational fashion. But what's important is the connection with the line itself. And so this leads me to the final thing, and now we're out of the sort of the introduction of the concept into what does this aspire to? What does this look like at a high level? So if you have read a novel or a book where there's dialogue and you come to know a character quite well, and you can begin to imagine how they might sound, and you can think, what would this character say? What would Harry Potter say in this context? What would Severus Snape say? What would Aragorn from Lord of the Rings say? What would Humbert from Lolita say in this context, in this conversation? And you can project characters' thoughts and voices even in your own head. You can imagine these conversations, and you can have conversations with fictional characters. This is, unfortunately, I don't mean to pick on Christians, but often how prayer works. We've read a lot of the Bible, and then you imagine what they would say, and you call that counter voice God, and you reinterpret it. That's happening. But there is a valid spirituality in that action. And if you are familiar with your parents, if you are familiar with your grandparents, if you've heard the stories about your great-grandparents and your great-great-grandparents, perhaps read something they've written, and you begin to develop a sense of what they sounded like, how they thought, what they would say in a certain context, you can have these sorts of mental conversations with them as well. But there comes a point, there comes a threshold beyond which you're no longer just projecting your own mental image of what they would say, or vocals of what they would say, and talking with yourself anymore. Past a certain threshold, once you've done that long enough, the voice takes on a life of its own, and you hear not just yourself speak in their voice, but you actually hear them speak. Actually hear them, their spirit, or what will sound like their spirit. It isn't actually them, because they're dead. But it's not just you anymore either. If you want the science sort of giving a secular view of this phenomenon, then the book to read is The Origins of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind by Julian Jaynes. But the experience of it goes beyond the science. And my supposition is that that voice that's speaking isn't necessarily the individual, but it is the spirit of the line, which is of which you are a part, but it's not just you either. And that is a high star to reach for, but I'm convinced it is perhaps eventually achievable with time. So that's a basic introduction to the concept of the Anwei, its spirituality, what differentiates it from Reconstructionism, pagan Reconstructionism, and Christianity, and why I think it's a deity and a lifestyle worth pursuing.